This is the fifth session in the Organisational Resilience module, where I'm going to focus on empowerment and mental models. So I'm taking us through the various parts of organisational resilience. Here we are on empowerment and mental models. In other words, preparing, making sure that people within the organisation and the organisation as a whole indeed are ready for dealing with risk, dealing with uncertainty. They're in a position that they're able to do that. That the problems associated with preparation, the problems that organisations face can be reduced or minimised, and that they are in a state of readiness. Okay, there's a model, the diagram by my colleague Elmar Kutsch, who produced this. Having essentially what I think he's trying to do here is say, well, if the amorphous blob is the organisation with operational activities inside it, what we have are people within the organisation who are alert to risk, to uncertainty which threatens that organisation, both from without and within. Okay, so some of the key issues that I want you to think about as we go through this session are the first one: organisations seek to implement routines to drive out risk and uncertainty through consistency of performance. In other words, they seek to create repetition, to create procedures, to create, and as I said here, routines. And through repetition and routine, we have consistency of performance, operational performance, strategic performance indeed. And with performance, with repetition, organisations hope that uncertainty and risk will be minimised or even removed from the organisation. A problem with this is that organisations become rigid, inflexible, brittle is the word I frequently use, and tightly coupled. So the routines create dependencies within the organisation, within the different parts or systems within the organisation, which become dependent upon each other. And this inevitably leaves them vulnerable to shocks. In other words, they're becoming normal accident type or normal system type organisations. Now, for me, empowerment is the key issue, really, that employees and people within the organisation, parts of the organisation, teams within the organisation are empowered. They can be both compliant in that they understand routines and procedures are important to create efficiency, and yet flexible so that when those routines fail them, they are able to adapt and cope with unexpected situations. For each of these main sections, we have a lure. In this case, we've called it the lure of the failsafe. So this is a quote from our book: "Careful planning allows the organisation to think through the likely risks, uncertainties and complexities they will encounter." Okay, so organisations plan, think, carry out scenario planning, all the things I talked about in the last session. However, the temptation is only to prepare for what we know or suspect, and less for what we cannot yet imagine. In other words, we focus on risk. If we focus on anything at all, we focus on risk. So we privilege risk and things we are kind of conscious of, and forget that there's a whole load of other things out there which, who knows, who we can't even envisage. So despite our planning, despite our careful process of putting in place procedures to allow for all sorts of eventualities, these may not be adequate for all eventualities because we can't ever imagine what all eventualities might be. Okay, so in each of these sections, I'm structuring them in exactly the same way. We'll start with impediments or blockers or things which get in the way of what we're trying to achieve. In this case, things which stop preparation. There's a number of points which in our book we pick up. I'll touch on just some of these. Okay, so perhaps the biggest problem we think, and certainly some of our research has shown, is that risk management, uncertainty management, planning for management tends to actually just be a tick box exercise. We become complacent, we become optimistic, and Nobody really wants to. Wants to think about risk. No one wants to think about the threats. So, and in fact, through repetition of consistent good performance, risk doesn't happen. So perhaps that drives a complacency, which means that, okay, yes, we do risk management, yes, we go through this process of risk management within our organisation until ultimately it becomes this tick box exercise. Not actually achieving anything, we're doing it mindlessly. In fact, the temptation is to think of risk management itself as being unnecessary. Risk management is an expensive activity. It requires a lot of experienced resources in terms of people, maybe consultants from outside to help us with it, and a lot of time is dedicated to risk management and thinking about risk and thinking about uncertainty. Maybe it's just an expensive waste of time because these risks have never materialised. So risk management and uncertainty management become relegated to a tick box exercise. Why do we do it? We do it because we're told to do it. So it in itself becomes a routine, a procedure, rather than something we're entering into in the spirit of understanding the threats and indeed the opportunities that the organisation faces. In the teaching session, I talked about the case of the Titanic. In the case of the Titanic, it sank because it's sinking because they prepared for everything, every eventuality, except an uncertainty they hadn't envisaged, which was the behaviour of the captain, behaviour of the navigator, and certain unlikely situations, so a combination of situations which occurred, which inevitably led to the sinking of the Titanic. They thought they had lots of redundancy, they had lots of risk management built into the construction of the Titanic, and yet it still sank. And the famous phrase is just rearranging the deck chairs and ignoring the sinking. They were ignoring sinking because they were so confident the risk management had been followed, they had procedures and routines they were following, and they weren't mindful or conscious until it was too late that there was a threat there. Storr and colleagues talk about something called threat rigidity theory, and Meurlink, Wilkerson and Peets and Townsend, as you can see in that reference down there, take this to use a metaphor for threat rigidity, which is what they call autistic management. Threat rigidity is an interesting concept that organisations, remember we're talking about the impediments to dealing with uncertainty. Organisations, in the face of threat, so the theory goes, become rigid, centralised, proceduralised. They fall back on procedure in the hope that procedure will see them through the threat they face. They become, as Meurlink et al. Say, autistic. So in the crisis, managers focus on what they do well and what they know. They focus on the core product, the core service, and ignore all the peripheral things. This leads to greater hierarchy and top-down control. In other words, we report things to our bosses, who report them to their bosses, and so on and so forth. The problem gets passed up the organisational hierarchical chain, and people then focus on their operational activities rather than focusing on the big picture. The procedures become backward-looking. Processes stifle the flexibility required to engage with novelty and surprise. So to focus a little bit more on threat rigidity, this is a famous concept which Storr and colleagues came up with. You can see the reference there to the paper they published in Administrative Science Quarterly. It's very, very famous and is a way of understanding how organisations cope or don't cope in the case of novelty and uncertainty. So there's a threat. The idea goes there's a change within the environment, either internally or externally, this can lead to a threat, which for Store is an impending loss or cost to the entity, to the organisation, from our point of view. This leads to two things. One is a restriction of information. Information becomes on a need-to-know basis. Information becomes compartmentalised, and also a constriction of control. So control constricts latitude and ability to act. We go back to the routines and procedures which we know work and follow those religiously. This creates a rigidity in response, a tendency towards well-learned and dominant responses. We just do the things we know have worked in the past. Now, the important thing to notice in this is that through incremental change, through small changes, or small threats, small risks, it's actually worked extremely well. So focusing on what we do, having a set of procedures to deal with small threats is fantastic. It enables organisations to work their way through that problem, work their way through that threat, and come out and tackle the threat and then get back to normal operating procedures very quickly. So under incremental change, it leads to a reduction in threat. That's great. However, under what Store calls radical change, the threat becomes intensified. It actually makes the problem worse. It creates more problems for the organisation. So just like in the case of the Titanic, if it was small changes, small problems, then they'd be dealt with through procedures, routines. The organisation would have a plan. Where there's a radical problem, a radical threat, a massive iceberg which is going to create a gash right across the edge of the ship, a high level of complacency among the crew of the ship, then this creates an intensification of the threat. In the case of the Titanic, the ship sank. Okay, so this picture is showing a picture of a university, the first university I had a job at, which you can see is called the University of Bath, and it's supposed to illustrate silos. You may think, well, how does this illustrate silos? It's a relatively new university, built in the 1960s, this building, and what it illustrates for me, because I worked there so I was familiar with it, is that it was designed so that the different departments and the different schools functioned as an entity. That the idea was that there was no barriers between the different areas. You could walk from one edge of the end of the university right around and through to the other end of the university, through every single department, without actually leaving the building. You just go through door after door after door, and you get from one department to another department to another department. So, for example, I was in the Department of Management, School of Management, and this was separated by no more than a door to pharmacy and mathematics. It sounds fantastic. The idea was to create collaboration, to create an environment where ideas were integrated and were passed from department to department. New ideas were thought through, and collaborations created new areas for research and new ways of thinking. It didn't work. These doors, one door may as well be in a field, because each department was in a silo. Each department focused on what it did and ignored everything around it. So, great idea to try and reduce silos, failed. The failure was through, in the case of the universities, and get it in every university, and in fact in organisations up and down the land, everywhere, you find that there's a geographical separation. That geographical separation could be a field, it could be a city, it could be just a door. But that's enough to create a geographical and physical separation between the different, in this case, departments, which were the silos of the organisation. What's the problem with silo mentality? What's the problem with thinking as departments? The problem is a reluctance to share information, building what we call fiefdoms, little areas of control, little areas of power within the organisation for their own sake rather than for any operational gain, and avoiding responsibility, blaming other parts of the organisation when things go wrong. This leads to some of these points here. A localised, disconnected decision making. So decision making happens in the little silos and little departments or sections of the organisation without really much reference to the other sections. Okay, there's a lack of ownership of problems, of delivery, of organisational performance. Organisations become designed to resist change. Why are we being changed? Why isn't that other department being changed? Why us? Why not them? Why are we the guinea pigs for a new change? So organisations become sclerotic. An abundance of brilliance leading to what's called collective stupidity. It's a great phrase. So we have a lot of brilliance within an organisation. Universities are a good example, full of brilliant people, but as a collective organisation can behave in a very slow, ponderous, sclerotic and indeed stupid way. And the nature of work can become unsatisfactory, and a blame culture can predominate. And here we are as a diagram to demonstrate disjointed processes and functional silos. Okay, so there I've picked up two or three points there about some of the blockers which stop organisations being prepared for risk, being prepared for the threats they face. So how can we enable preparation? Again, there's a number of points here which we can, some of which I'll talk about, others of which are covered in our book, but really I want to focus on just one or 2 points here. Okay, in the teaching session I talked about a famous case of a Boeing 747, where all the engines failed. So that's got 4 engines. That's a load of engineering redundancy there. These aircraft can actually fly on just 1 engine. They don't need 4 engines. So the aircraft was built with engineering redundancy, and yet all 4 engines failed. How did the aircraft not crash? Well, actually, thankfully, the engines came back on. But in the meantime, the crew stayed incredibly calm. The crew has its own organisational and personal redundancy. They have skills, capabilities. There's 2 or even 3 members of a pilot, a co-pilot, and even a third, a navigator or another person on the flight deck. And so they have lots of redundancy there. They have redundancy in skills and capabilities. They have procedures which they can follow, but they can turn to their training and to their experience to help them deal and tackle with problems they might face. So there's a nice example of both where engineering redundancy, which is commonplace within organisations, fails. Organisational redundancy can take over. So yes, all engines failed. So what we're interested in here is organisation as opposed to engineering or technical redundancy. So built-in redundancy is a foundation stone in our knowledge about the technologies on which we depend. Virtually all technologies have loads of redundancy built into them. It's a core principle, as I said there, of engineering design, equated to safety and integrity. There are problems. Engineering redundancy, despite best efforts, as in the case of the British Airways Boeing 747 over the Pacific, can fail. Organisational redundancy, on the other hand, takes the form of all sorts of things. Scepticism, and more commonly, additional slack resources. Scepticism, do we really trust the engineering redundancy we have? And slack resources can be in the form of capabilities as well as additional people. Okay, what does organisational redundancy achieve? It allows cross-checks, doubts that precautions are sufficient, and wariness about claimed levels of competence. That's scepticism. Conceptual slack. We can think about different possibilities, different ways of doing something. Different people with different backgrounds and different skills can look at the same problem in different ways. So divergent perspectives. Okay, so here's a way of thinking about empowerment. So that's redundancy I've talked about briefly, now empowerment. One of the ways of helping people with an organisation prepare is to empower them. The traditional approach to dealing with a problem is to pass the problem or parts of the problem from person to person or group to group within the organisation, eventually coming back to settle on the problem. What we suggest is that an empowered way of doing it is to get those different expertise within the organisation brought together to tackle the problem as a group rather than dealing with their own little bits and parts of the problem. We looked at this, in fact, in the Apollo 13 case. If you think about Apollo 13, it's a good example of how an organisation, a group of specialists, a group of very skilled scientists tackled a problem by not by thinking about it in little silos, but bringing all those experts together to tackle the one problem. One of the ways organisations can really help people to be prepared and think about problems they may face is through simulations, games, rehearsals, and those sort of activities. So there's a whole kind of area of research which is not really very closely linked to organisational research, interestingly, around this idea of games, rehearsals, simulations. It's about getting close to adversity, but getting close to adversity in a safe environment. We give ourselves disastrous situations which we may face, but these are simulations. These aren't real problems. You can think about it in terms of flight training. A flight trainer goes up in a goes in a simulator. It, to all intents and purposes, feels like a real plane. It's very immersive. They fly the aircraft, and then suddenly given a problem, or the engines might go out or something, and then they can understand the adversity that the simulation gives them without actually having to crash a plane. Or they can crash multiple times and understand what it feels like to crash a plane in a flight simulator without actually crashing a plane. These sort of approaches allow people within the organisation to create an understanding of the big picture, which is so crucial, I think, for people within organisations. Not to focus on their own little bit of the operation, but to understand how their part of the operation relates to everything else within the organisation. Develop what can be called memories of the future. So memories from the simulations, from the gaming they carried out, which will enable them to tackle things in the future. It means that it enables them to share intelligence and meaning, what goes on, why it happened, why things happen, why things can happen, how things can go wrong, and what that means for them within the organisation. And also build confidence that they are going to be successful, that they can cope with problems and disasters which they may encounter. So practice and rehearsal of routines happens in advance. In the teaching session, I talked about different approaches organisations can take, and actually, I've got an OR. So the first one, snakes, is a little clip which shows very much a team thinking about coping with difficulty. The second one was much more of a financial simulation. Both are very useful within organisations, and you can see the little greyed out areas. We'll give you a link to the YouTube clips which I used. So I talked about routines and routines within organisations and how these can lead to an organisation's being brittle, being fragile, being vulnerable. As I said earlier, and I'll repeat here, routines serve a very important role in organisations. All organisations have routines and procedures, and these are crucial to the organisation being operationally efficient, but also, as I said here, providing policies for stable, secure, repeatable work environments. So routines are crucial to organisations. However, sometimes those routines, what do they become? Do they become ostensive or performative? Bruno Latour talked about performative routines things we just do because we do them. We do them for the benefit of others. We do them to because this is what we do as human beings. We're doing a performance rather than ostensive routines which actually have some sort of purpose. So routines can become performative. And the problem with this is it includes blind adherence to habitual practice. We just do things because we do them. This is what we do in this organisation. This is how we do it, without anyone questioning why and whether this is what we should be doing. And acting practices mindlessly. So we just carry out routines, practices, without thinking about what this is achieving for the organisation or where things might go wrong. Practices become decoupled from written procedure. So I talked about practical drift. This is where practical drift happens. Unnoticed accumulation of discrepant practices can happen. Again, practical drift. One of the things organisations try to achieve, or should be trying to achieve, is organisational flexibility. What is organisational flexibility? It has a number of dimensions, and you can see the reference at the bottom there. So, a temporal dimension. So this is about time. We are able to flex time. We're able to think about time in different ways. Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Okay? Range dimension. The intention dimension, so what we intend to do. The focus and the focus of the organisation. So most organisations combine aspects of flexibility and inflexibility. They have routines and procedures which are rigid and fixed, and at the same time they have some flexibility. And it's a balance between these which is so crucial to organisations, particularly where they face risky or highly uncertain or highly threat-inducing environments. So flexibility is very useful. Perhaps critical, but not cost-free. Flexibility requires redundancy, as we've seen. It requires breaking down silos, people working as teams. It requires additional capabilities. It requires simulations and rehearsals. All of this comes at costs. And that cost is the efficiency of the organisation. It's pulling people away from normal day-to-day operations and asking to do things outside those operations, which is preparing for something which, as we've seen, may never happen. So there's a continual tension between control, procedure, routine, and the flexibility that allows people to, and the organisation as a whole, to cope with the vicissitudes of the environment. This is a nice bit of research, well, not really even research, a nice way of thinking which I came across, quite by chance really. So I was thinking about how this rigidness and routine on the one hand and responsiveness on the other hand were related to each other. And it transpired that this guy, Robert Stevens, who was the CIO, Chief Information Officer of Leadership and IT Innovation in Harley-Davidson, came up with this concept of freedom with fences. It's a lovely little model which helps to illustrate what goes on, how organisations can think about the relationship between routine, procedure, which are need, and yet have a level of responsiveness that's appropriate to any particular operational situation. And essentially it comes with a set of rules, and I'll go through some of these rules now. So these rules are: 1, understand the origin of each rule, procedure, routine within the organisation, within the operation, and codify it and understand its purpose. Okay, so why are we doing what we do? What's the purpose of carrying out these procedures? It's about what Bruno Latour called performative and ostensive routines, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, the organisations want ostensive routines because they are driving operational efficiency. They don't want performative routines because those are actually wasteful. They are less efficient. You're doing things for the sake of doing them. The second rule was to put an expiry date on each rule or procedure. So essentially what this means is continually revisiting the procedures which have been carried out in the operation and making sure they still are fit for purpose, they still have a purpose, they still are achieving what we want them to achieve. And the third one is to be a reluctant rule maker, a reluctant routine creator. Strive for brevity and design simplicity. This allows, in this process, what you allow is responsiveness among your workers, among people who are delivering operations within the organisation. It allows them the freedom they need in order to operate within rules, yes, but actually be mindful, be aware of what threats and uncertainties they face, and tackle those. So it's a lovely little model which I came across, not really written up anywhere, I don't think. I've employed it in the book which we wrote, but really it's, you don't really see it very much, but I think it's actually crucial. This picture here is illustrating the planning horizon. It goes back to what I said right at the outset of the module, which is that we have a way of thinking about risk. We can plan so far and no further, because we get into increasing levels of uncertainty. So what we need to do is raise ourselves up, gather more information, gather more data, so that our planning becomes more controlled. We have a better understanding of what we're planning for. The problem with long planning horizons is that the predictions we make have limitations. Eventually we get to everything being uncertain. Okay? Nothing is going to stay the same. Everything changes. The world is full of change, and we need to kind of recognise that. So the limits on the range of risk management, which becomes increasingly less useful. Risk management is great in the here and now, in a week from now, a month from now, even a year from now, but eventually it becomes useless. Okay? So we need to think about how we can expand our scope by expanding the risk horizon. Remember I talked about the risk horizon? Well, that's what I'm thinking about here. This is a quote from Martin Luther King: "You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step." And really, this is about taking our first approaches towards preparing and becoming prepared for uncertainty. Okay, so this next section, as I say, all the sections are common, is about issues which enable preparation. So in this case, we're looking at issues that enable preparation. And you can see again a number of points. I'll just pick up on a couple of them. First one is goal direction. So we have goals for the organisation over a period of time. We plan something and then we deliver it. We plan it and deliver it. What do we do as an organisation? Do we put up barriers? So we have these risks, stakeholders, threats to the delivery of our goals. Do we put up barriers to keep everything out? Which is what organisations do. They put up barriers, physical barriers like factories, things happening within factories, or organisational barriers, organisational buffers like inventory or capacity, spare capacity. So these are all barriers to stop threats getting in. An alternative approach of thinking about this is to have flexible goals, to not be rigid in terms of what we're going to have in terms of the goals, but understand the strategic purpose of the goals we're trying to achieve through our operations. So we have flexible goals there at the end there, and the stakeholders and the risks are threats and opportunities. Okay, so the organisation is trying to, throughout delivery, create deliverables which will add to value creation over time. And that's what that model is trying to show there. Going back to empowerment, what we want is quick response and situated decision making. How do we achieve this? Well, a major part of this is through leadership. So remember, I'm talking about some issues which enable preparation. Transformative leadership is one of those issues. Okay, so transformative as opposed to transactional leadership allows on-the-spot feedback, quick communication, so the leader and the senior staff are involved in providing feedback and communication with people within teams and within operations. We have an executive mentality that people at all levels of the organisation see themselves as executives and see themselves as strategic decision makers. We maintain challenge, so we keep things interesting, keep things within the organisation difficult, and that difficulty is not insurmountable, but it's just there, a bit of a challenge to keep people alert. People have freedom to express flexibility and creativity. This means a lot of leadership, a lot of involvement by leaders in the delivery of the operations, rather than just sitting back and letting it just happen. Okay, understanding boundaries and limitations. This needs to be communicated by leaders, and difficulties for leadership and management and workers is around trust. Okay, do the workers, do the staff trust their leaders? Do the leaders trust their workers? Ultimately, empowerment is about allowing greater autonomy and latitude to act. When things go wrong, they have freedom to act. It's that idea of freedom of fences, but it's also a cultural thing. Some of the barriers that organisations face are structural. So hierarchy becomes a major problem. If you have many layers of reporting, then we have very slow decision making. So organisational structures can be really important. Flat structures with very few levels of reporting, then decisions made quickly. And empowerment through wider silos and what sometimes called boundary spanners. It's a funny term, but it's about people who operate between, whose role is to operate between different silos, different departments. Silos are inevitable in organisations. They always happen. So what some organisations do is have these people whose purpose, or groups of people whose purpose is to create communication and create collaboration between different parts of the organisation. So structural factors are important. Cultural factors are important as well. In particular, what Carl Weick in his manifesto, if you like, for HRO called deference to expertise, that the person situated at the operational level is the expert in any particular situation, and these people are given the latitude to act. And geographical, we have real-time and personal communication. People who are involved in the situation are there at the time in order to allow exchange of ideas quickly when the organisation is under threat. The temptation for people within organisations, and this goes back to threat rigidity, is to return to procedure. If I've done what I have to do, then I can't be blamed if something goes wrong. Okay, so it's incentivising people to go beyond complying to procedure and complying to routine. Okay, to be prepared to go beyond routine and procedure. Very difficult for people to do in situations of threat. It's very difficult for people to do something which makes them accountable, makes them somebody who could be blamed for something going wrong. So this is cultural partly, but also here's some factors which are important to this. Encourage mindfulness through rewards. I'll talk later about behaviour-based expectations, which picks up on that point. It's difficult to develop the right reward structure. We need intrinsic motivations as well as extrinsic. Extrinsic motivations are normally financial, but can be other forms of reward. But intrinsic motivations are things like kudos and seeing that this is holding this person up as a figurehead, as a person who's done something really well. The focus is on ensuring goals are understood. What are we trying to achieve within this organisation? What is the role of the operation in achieving what we want to do overall? Balancing long-term and short-term targets and rewarding risk and uncertainty identification. So uncertainty and risk management and planning become crucial parts of organisational activity. Finally, let's think about some of the things across organisations. So this isn't just within an organisation. Organisations are part of supply chains and have customers and suppliers, and for these are linked to the organisation. So how can we create preparation across those organisations? I'll just pick up on one point I think here. Okay, well, a couple of points. Okay, so integrating stakeholders. For suppliers and contractors, risk is invariably normalised. Okay, and confidence abounds. People within supply chains understand that their customers want something to be achieved, and they're not going to tell them this is dangerous or difficult or risky. So risk becomes normalised. This is just the way we do things. Okay, this needs to be so they need to properly incentivise suppliers and contractors to engage with the preparation process, to understand that risk isn't a normal situation, but should be abnormal, should be something which needs to be understood and carefully planned for, managed, and then beyond that, we need to look. Suppliers and contractors need to help in looking for uncertainty. The other point there is need to seek to enable customers and clients to understand the need to provide sufficient resource. So understanding risk, understanding uncertainty isn't a free activity. Okay? If we could just ignore it and focus on routine and procedure, and then our suppliers and contractors will be very efficient. But in the face of crisis, they will crumble, they will be brittle. So customers and clients rather, need to provide the resource to allow the flexibility within and among the suppliers and contractors. An example which I've taken as a way of integrating redundancy across organisations is post the 2008 financial crisis. In the UK, what was created was a series of capital buffers. It started with the person at the top, in this case Philip Hammond, before him the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's the head of the government treasury. Here they were able to ask the Independent Commission on Banking to then ask the Bank of England to insist that the key banks operating within the UK develop their own capital buffers. So there's the British banks, and we have a whole load of different banks which all develop, and others, these are just some of them, some of the main ones, and they all were required to develop very large capital buffers in order to prepare themselves for future crises they may encounter, rather than requiring the government to come in and bail them out, which is what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, so you can see there's a series of organisations who are all interrelated, and the government is taking a leading role in this process. Effectively, we have supply chain of the financial system supply chain here. Okay, so we got to the end of this session, and here are some key points I want you to think about and take away from this. Routines and procedures lead to efficiency and consistency of performance. They are crucial to organisational efficiency. They are crucial to enabling organisations to sell their products and services in a competitive environment. But, and the big but is, this leads to inflexibility in the face of uncertainty. How can organisations cope with this? They can prepare the people within the organisation, prepare the organisation as a whole, and the organisation's suppliers, and the organisation's customers indeed, to cope with uncertainty and risk. People in organisations need to be prepared with ways to make sense of risk and uncertainty through games, rehearsals, role plays, and that sort of thing, and have the flexibility. This enables them to have the flexibility to act. And then we looked at the big brown box case, and there it is.